I found Greta Baumann's letter in a thin cardboard box labelled Repatriations, Women, 1945. The kind of box that smells like dust and old glue. It wasn't meant for me. It was addressed to Lisa K., with a return line that only said, Greta, Hamburg. Greta didn't write about battles. She wrote about a Louisiana train platform, a silent line of black guards, and a sergeant named Wilson who shoved a blanket into her arms during a storm like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. The camp stamp is smeared, the unit line is missing, and Wilson is the only full name she gives. That little blank space bothers me more than the paper's age. Tonight, I'm calling the records desk in Baton Rouge and booking the first morning flight. If I can pin down which camp held German women that spring, I can find who Wilson was and why Greta carried his discipline home like a confession. In early April 1945, a troop train crept into southern Louisiana carrying German women who had been taught to fear America more than death. Greta Baumann tried to see the platform before the doors opened, because surprise was the one thing a prisoner could not afford. She expected shouting and rough hands. What she found was silence that made her skin tighten. Greta was 22 and had spent the last months of the war behind paperwork, not behind a rifle. She typed orders, stamped lists, and moved messages for units that were dissolving. That distance let her pretend she was only near the violence, until the retreat collapsed and the pretense collapsed with it. When she was captured, she expected vengeance. She expected it more fiercely because every poster and lecture had promised a special threat. Black American soldiers were savages, and America was putting them in uniform to frighten Germans into submission. The brakes screamed, the latch clanged, the doors rolled back, sunlight cut into the dark car, and humid air poured in like warm water. On the platform, a line of black soldiers stood in formation, rifles held the same way, boots aligned, faces set. No grinning, no taunts, no casual cruelty. They looked like men doing a job they had practiced until it became boring. The women inside the car went still together. Greta stared, searching for the chaos she had been promised, and the absence of it struck harder than shouting would have. Her mind tried to repair the contradiction. If they were disciplined, then the brutality must be controlled, saved for later, delivered cleanly. That idea kept fear intact, and fear was familiar. An English voice snapped instructions, and a translator repeated them in German. Stand, file out, hands visible, no sudden moves. Greta stepped down and felt the air stick to her skin. The nearest guard did not shove her. He did not soften either. He watched the line the way a machinist watches a belt, ready to stop a snag before it becomes a disaster. Greta could not decide if that steadiness was mercy or simply competence. They marched to trucks and drove through flat land that smelled of swamp and growing things. The camp appeared as wire fences, watchtowers, and long barracks raised off the ground. Inside the wire, roads were straight, signs were posted, a schedule was nailed to a board. Greta kept waiting for the mask to fall, for some private pleasure in their control. Instead, she met procedure. Instructions repeated, movements counted, a place that seemed to run on paper. Processing took most of the day. Names were checked, belongings searched, bodies inspected for illness. A clerk stamped forms, a guard counted heads again. Nobody struck her. Nobody offered kindness. The impersonal efficiency made her feel small in a new way. In Germany, humiliation had usually been personal. Here it was structural, and that made it harder to argue against. That night, the women's barracks filled with whispering theories. Some said the black guards were a trick, with white officers really in control. Others insisted the Americans were staging discipline now to break them later. Greta listened and stayed quiet. She knew the fence could hurt her, but the women around her could decide whether she slept in peace. Silence kept her from being selected for anyone's anger, but it also forced her to swallow questions she could not stop asking. After lights out, She pulled a small notebook from where it was hidden under her clothing. She'd carried it through retreat because words were the only property she still owned. She wrote the platform exactly as she saw it. A silent line, aligned rifles, faces that did not match the posters. She avoided slogans on purpose. Slogans would let her rewrite the memory later. The record felt like control. It was also contraband, and she could feel the danger of it even as she closed the cover. In the morning, an American officer addressed them through a translator. He spoke about camp rules, sanitation, work assignments, and the Geneva Convention. In Germany, Greta had heard the phrase treated as a foreign fantasy. Here it was read like a checklist. Rations, medical care, mail, pay for labor, discipline under posted rules. Greta listened for the trap and heard a system instead. A system could be humane. A system could also grind people down without ever raising a hand. Food tested the body before it tested the mind. In Germany, Greta's last months had been thin soup and bread that tasted like compromise. Here she was given eggs, biscuits, and coffee. Hunger hit like a shove. She tried to eat slowly, then swallowed too fast and felt her stomach heave. Across the room, a woman vomited into a trash can, not from disgust, but from a body that could not absorb plenty without pain. Greta forced herself to keep eating, because weakness here would be watched and measured. By the end of the first week, the routines became familiar. Roll calls, work details, meals, posted rules enforced with clipped commands. Into the barracks vacuum stepped Frau Kessler, older, sharp-tongued, and certain. She said the food was bait, the wages were seduction, the rules were a cage designed to make them grateful. Her certainty calmed frightened women who needed an explanation that preserved their old world. Greta did not challenge Kessler. She let the talk wash over her and kept writing at night, paying for her quiet with growing suspicion from women who needed everyone to believe the same thing. Greta was assigned to a cleaning detail near administrative buildings and sometimes the camp library. The work was dull, but it gave her a narrow advantage. Posted notices, discarded newspapers, scraps of English conversation. She watched guards check lists and correct prisoners without spectacle. She watched prisoners correct each other more harshly than the guards did. The camp's order kept refusing to become the brutality she expected, and that refusal began to feel like pressure on her own beliefs. Each night, she wrote short notes. What rules were posted, what the guards did, what Kessler said, what her own stomach did after food. She told herself she was only recording. In truth, she was building evidence against the day she would be forced to decide which story she would tell about the war, her country, and herself. The first real conversation began because Greta made a small, necessary mistake. One evening she sat under pine trees near the work area and wrote while there was still light. Days in captivity blur, and blurred days are easy to rewrite into comforting myths. She did not see the shadow until it fell across her page. A black sergeant stood a few steps away, posture straight, eyes on her hands. His name tape read, Wilson. Greta's first instinct was to hide the notebook. Her hands moved, then froze. Sudden movement around armed men is how accidents happen. Wilson did not reach for the book. He asked in careful English what she was writing. Greta understood enough to answer with the simplest truth she could afford: to remember. She expected confiscation or an insult. Instead, he told her evenly that personal writing was allowed as long as it did not include plans or incitement. It sounded like policy, not mercy, and the lack of drama unsettled her more than shouting would have. She risked a question that had been burning since the platform. Why follow rules with enemies? Wilson looked at her without heat and said the rules were what kept a uniform from turning into a mob. He said it like a line he had used to hold himself together. The answer forced Greta to treat him as a thinking person, not as a propaganda symbol. That shift cost her more than fear did, because fear had a place in her old system. Respect did not. Greta asked another question, quieter. Why wear an American uniform if Americans treated him as less than equal? Wilson hesitated, then spoke in plain terms. Buses, polling places, jobs, the way a mother is told where she can sit. He did not dramatize it. He described it as normal, which was worse. Greta had been taught that America's power came from racial order. Here was a man describing America's racial disorder and still standing in disciplined formation, still doing his job. The contradiction did not comfort her. It made her feel as if she had been living inside a cheap story. Greta returned to the barracks with her thoughts running tight circles. She did not tell Kessler. She told only Lisa, a quiet woman who had stopped repeating slogans and started asking what was true. Sharing created a small alliance and a shared risk. If Kessler decided those two were contaminated, life could become punishment without any American involvement. Over the next days, Greta watched the guards differently. She waited for cruelty and found routine. She watched for sadism and found paperwork. Discipline, when it happened, was quick and limited. A shouted correction, a changed assignment, short confinement for someone who pushed too far. The camp's normalcy began to feel like a mirror held up to her country. If the enemy could follow rules under pressure, what did it say about the people in Germany who had claimed they had no choice? The mirror sharpened in the library. During a cleaning shift, Greta saw newspapers stacked on a table. She recognized dates, foreign city names, and the word camp repeated. Kessler had warned them. American lies meant to poison German minds. Greta picked up a paper anyway, because doubt demands fuel. The photographs hit her first. Bodies piled, living people reduced to bones, faces that looked emptied out. Her first reaction was anger, because anger is easier than grief. She tried to tell herself it was staged. Then she noticed details that did not look staged. The dirt, the angles, the way the men in American uniforms in the photos stood like people who had stepped into something they could not bargain with. She forced herself to read what she could, piecing meaning from familiar place names and simple English. It described camps in Europe being opened and what was found inside. Greta hid the newspaper under rags and carried it back to the barracks. She showed it to Lisa in a corner where shadows were thick. Lisa stared until her breathing turned shallow. They did not have enough words to match what they were seeing, and the lack of words did not protect them. It trapped them in the image. The two of them became witnesses, and being a witness felt like being marked. Kessler sensed the shift, the way predators sense weakness. She demanded to know what Greta had brought in. Women closest to Kessler leaned forward, hungry to see, hungry to judge. Greta lied and said it was about relief shipments and rationing. The lie bought time. It also exposed something ugly. Greta could still lie smoothly when fear demanded it. She had spent years telling herself lies were enemy tools. Now she felt how easily lies become a home. The barracks split more visibly after that. Some women clung harder to slogans. Some stopped speaking and watched, eyes scanning for weakness the way starving people scan for food. Kessler began holding talks about loyalty, warning that Germany would remember who faltered and that weak minds would be punished when they returned. Her control was social, not physical. She made people afraid of being alone. That fear organized the room around her. Greta carried the paper's truth in her head like a weight. She did not know what to do with it. She could not send it home. She could not argue it out in the barracks. She returned to the Pines and found Wilson again on duty. She did not show him the paper. She asked, carefully, whether the Americans were telling the truth about what they were finding in Europe. Wilson did not pretend certainty. He said he had heard enough reports to believe something terrible had happened. Then he said a sentence that pinned her. "If you don't look, you can pretend. Pretending is how it keeps going." That sentence shifted responsibility back onto Greta. It meant she could no longer claim ignorance as a shelter. It also meant her notebook mattered in a new way. It was not only memory. It was proof that she had looked when it would have been safer not to. Proof is dangerous in a camp because it cannot be negotiated. One night, hearing Kessler whisper with others near the bunks, Greta almost destroyed her notebook and the folded clippings she had hidden. Burning it would reduce the risk. It would also erase the only honest trail she had left. She held the pages over a trash bin, then pulled them back. She chose danger over erasure, and the choice made her stomach knot for hours. Then the storm arrived and made every argument physical. Wind bent the pines and rain hammered the roof until seams gave way. Water ran down the walls. The lights flickered, then died. Women shouted. Someone fell. Greta's body remembered bombings, and her brain translated thunder into aircraft. Panic spread faster than the water. In the crush, Greta grabbed Lisa's arm and tried to pull her toward the door. A shoulder slammed Greta's ribs and stole her breath. For a moment, ideology meant nothing. Only bodies mattered. The door burst open, and guards in ponchos pushed inside with flashlights. Greta heard Wilson's voice, loud, precise, without panic. He was not threatening them. He was directing them. He and other guards formed a corridor with their bodies, forcing a line where there had been none. They pushed the women toward the exit and out into the rain. The control was firm and impersonal. It saved lives. Outside, mud pulled at boots. A guard shoved a blanket into Greta's arms as if it were another issued item. Another handed her a cup of hot coffee that burned her palms back into the present. Greta accepted it because her teeth were chattering too hard to refuse. Accepting help from the people she had been trained to despise finished breaking the old story. She could not call them beasts while their hands were keeping her alive. When the storm eased and the women were counted, Kessler tried to reclaim control. She called the rescue a performance, proof that Americans wanted gratitude so they could demand obedience later. Greta heard it and felt something turn solid. She did not argue. She simply stopped believing Kessler could explain the world. Kessler noticed, and the notice carried a threat. The barracks could become hostile without any American involvement. 2 nights later, Greta found Wilson under the pines checking a list by flashlight. She went to him because she could not carry her contradictions back across the ocean without speaking them aloud. If she stayed silent, habit would rebuild the old machinery in her head. She approached in the open, accepting that if someone saw her, the barracks would become a courtroom. Greta told him she had believed lies about black soldiers and repeated them because repetition was safer than doubt. She told him she had seen the photographs and could not unsee them. She admitted she did not know how much she had known in Germany, only that she had avoided knowing more when it was convenient. Saying it out loud stripped away excuses. It also gave her shame a shape she could carry without drowning. Wilson listened without offering comfort. He said he could not forgive on behalf of the dead. He said the only honest move after seeing truth was to stop passing poison forward. It was not absolution. It was direction. Greta felt a path open that she did not like but could not deny. Direction meant obligation, and obligation lasts longer than fear. Soon after, the camp posted news that Germany was beaten and the war was ending everywhere. Repatriation would happen in waves. Greta felt relief, then dread. Relief because captivity was ending. Dread because captivity had been, strangely, a place where rules were visible, and she was about to return to a country where people would invent stories to survive the ruins. When the departure list was posted, Greta saw her name beside Lisa's. Movement was coming. So was judgment. Kessler made one last effort to tighten the barracks around her. She warned that Germany would remember who had been soft, and she watched Greta with the calm cruelty of someone who believes she will regain power soon. Greta did not challenge her. She protected her notebook, kept her face flat, and moved through the final days like a woman carrying contraband. She boarded the ship with evidence intact, and with the understanding that evidence would not be welcomed as a gift. The transport ship smelled of metal, diesel, and crowded bodies. German voices filled the compartments, rough with hunger and grievance. Many of the men aboard had come from harsher camps, and their stories carried authority. Beatings, cold, long labor, guards who treated them like animals. Their suffering demanded a single conclusion. Allies are monsters, Germans are victims. And any other version sounded like betrayal. The spark came fast. A gaunt man with a scar down his cheek watched Greta and Lisa speaking together near a ladder well and sneered that women always had it easy. He said they traded softness for favors and that any woman claiming Americans were decent was either lying or bought. Faces turned toward Greta. The compartment narrowed into a stage. Greta understood she had seconds to choose between safety and truth. Silence would have protected her. Silence would have kept her off the list of enemies in a ship that could become a cage. But Greta had already tested what silence costs. Silence was how she had lived in Germany, typing orders, watching lists shrink, refusing to ask what came after the paperwork. Silence had not saved anyone in those photographs. She stepped forward and spoke in plain German, careful to stay factual. She said she had been guarded in Louisiana by black soldiers who kept discipline and followed posted rules. She said she had watched them pull women out of a flooding barracks during a storm, hand out blankets, and pass coffee without mockery. The reaction arrived like a wave. Men laughed. Men spat, traitor, and brainwashed. They said black guards were animals in polished boots, and if she thought otherwise, she must be stupid. They attacked her character because attacking facts would require doubt. Greta felt shame rise, the old German fear of being judged by Germans, and forced herself to keep her voice steady. If she sounded uncertain, the story would be crushed for sport. Lisa stepped up beside her and repeated the details, adding the open rules and the newspapers in the camp library. 2 witnesses changed the geometry. It was harder to dismiss as fantasy, so the crowd shifted to anger. Insults grew louder. Someone muttered that the women had been turned. Greta heard the word and recognized the tactic. If you cannot refute a witness, you declare the witness diseased. The argument climbed toward violence the way a fire climbs when fed. A man shoved Greta's shoulder hard enough to make her stumble. Another raised a fist and hesitated, testing whether the room approved. Greta saw the mechanism she had watched in Germany, a crowd convincing itself that punishment is justice, that humiliation proves loyalty, that cruelty is righteous when aimed at the wrong person. Fear spread through bystanders who had been eager for spectacle and were now uncertain about the cost. A crewman pushed in and barked orders, threatening confinement for anyone who started a fight. Authorities stopped the escalation without healing anything. The circle loosened. Greta and Lisa backed away, hearts pounding. The crowd made room with faces that promised future judgment. The argument had not ended. It had only been delayed until land, where there would be no crewman to separate them. On deck later, wind dried sweat and salt on Greta's skin. She leaned on the rail and watched the sea roll under a grey sky. She had no victory to hold. She had not convinced the men. She had only made herself visible. The emptiness that followed scared her less than it should have, because another feeling was replacing it: clarity. Persuasion was not always possible. Refusal still mattered. She opened her notebook and reread the first entry about the Louisiana platform. A silent line, aligned rifles, discipline that did not match the posters. She reread the storm entry. Blanket, coffee, shouted orders to save rather than punish. The facts steadied her. They also sharpened the path ahead. If she kept this notebook, she would keep paying for it. If she burned it, she would be rebuilding the same culture of pretending that had made those photographs possible. Germany waited ahead, as a dim shape on the horizon, a country of ruins and excuses and the comfort of forgetting. Greta did not imagine she would change it with one story. She imagined something smaller and harder. When someone said black soldiers were beasts, she would answer with the platform. When someone said all allies were monsters, she would answer with the storm. When someone said, "We knew nothing," she would answer with her own shameful skill at avoiding what was convenient to avoid. The decision did not make her feel noble. It made her feel obligated. The camp had not proven America was pure. Wilson's own words about buses and voting had made sure Greta understood that. What the camp had done was strip her of the comfort of a single villain. It forced her to see disciplined men in uniforms she had been trained to despise, and then it forced her to see how easily her own mind had accepted poison and called it strength. She chose to remember anyway. She chose to be a witness, even if a witness is lonely. And as the ship carried her toward the broken coastline, she understood the price in advance. Truth would not rebuild her belonging, but it might keep her from helping rebuild the lie.